Welcome, folks, to this edition of the 700 Club. Could the United States look like Poland, Greece, or some other third world country? The answer is unfortunately yes. Skyrocketing national debt. The deficit is projected at $2.3 trillion in 2021, and that does not include the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. How much pork have the Democrats packed into this bill, and what else do they want that could cost $2 to $4 more trillion? Who's going to pay for it? What's going to happen? Is America almost broke? The answer is, unfortunately, yes. Caitlin Burke has this.
The House is expected to pass President Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package later this week. But in the Senate, Republicans plan to put up a fight.
Every single dollar we spend on COVID is something we're borrowing from our children or from China or from other places. So before we borrow more money to be able to spend on what people want, we need to make sure that we're covering only the essential needs. So let's borrow what we need to get through it, but not more than we need to.
While Republicans and fiscal conservatives can get behind the money going towards targeted COVID relief, like unemployment benefits and funding for vaccine distribution, they're concerned about the pork attached to this latest relief package.
So when those real needs drive up the deficit, we're going to have to tolerate it. But when we're talking about pet projects for members of Congress, absolutely should not be part of the conversation.
In February, the Congressional Budget Office projected the 2021 federal budget deficit to be $2.3 trillion, the second highest in our history. And that doesn't include this new $1.9 trillion relief package.
When you look at industrialized nations right now, there's only a handful of countries that are in as bad a fiscal shape as we are. When you look at the size of our economy relative to our debt, we're at about 100% debt to GDP ratio. That's bad news. That puts us in the same boat as the Greeces and Portugals and Italys of the world.
Still, the Biden administration is already laying the groundwork for an additional economic relief package focused on infrastructure. Some predicting it could cost another $2 to $4 trillion. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
You know, it used to be $1 billion was huge. You know, one of our presidents not too long ago said, I don't want to preside over a $100 billion budget. Well, $1 trillion. Our CBN News financial editor, Drew Parkhill, is here to talk about the threat that deficits pose to the economy. And the government, Drew, can pay interest on the deficits because rates are so low. But what happens if that rate goes up?
Well, let's talk about that, Pat. You know, 9 years ago, right now, I was talking with a friend of mine in the mortgage industry, and I told him, I said, you know, there's going to be one more low in mortgage rates, and it's going to come around 2020. Which is exactly what happened. Now, the reason I said that is because, Pat, you and I have talked on this show for decades about long cycles in the economy. Well, there are also long cycles in interest rates, and let me show you those. Okay, let me give you our first graphic here, which shows that in 1940, after the Depression, the 3-month T-bill rate, Pat, was well under 1%. It was 0.014%. Rates started gradually going up. By 1960, they were 3%, and in 1981, after the double-digit inflation of the late 70s into 1980, they were at 14%. Now, real rates, of course, were not that high, but nonetheless, you get the idea. The trend was way up. Now, let's look at what's happened since then. This is kind of the rise and fall of interest rates. In 1981, as we said, 14%. By 2000, they were down around high 5s to low 6%. In 2018, they briefly got to below 0 negative interest rates. Now, we've seen the bottom, I believe, and we're starting the long march upward again, and that is going to hurt the federal government because they are projecting that low rates are going to stay for a good while, but history suggests otherwise, that they're going to have to pay a lot more to pay off these deficits.
All right, Drew, let's look. Let's assume that it ticks up. Just the standard interest rate, say the 1 year, the short-term bonds, it goes up to 0.5%, then it goes up to 3/4, and it goes up to 1%. What is that going to do to the government deficit?
Well, here, let's take a look at what the government projections are right now. And we have a graphic on this, too. Okay. The interest payments on the deficit right now are $378 billion. The projection is that within 30 years, they're going to be $2.5 trillion. Now, obviously, the economy will be a lot bigger in 30 years, but relative to today's rates, that would be about roughly 6 times as big. In other words, the government is going to be paying 6 times as much in interest rates. And what they're assuming, Pat, is an average interest rate of 4.4%. This is out of the Congressional Budget Office. But if rates go up above that even a little bit, okay, it would add, let me show you something. It would add $30 trillion if they go up by 1 point on average over the next 30 years. That's an additional $30 trillion that need to be paid. And if rates go up by more than that, the annual interest cost, just the interest, not the deficit, but the interest would consume all of the tax revenue that the government takes in. That means no Defense Department, no Social Security, no Medicare, no anything, just paying back the interest because spending is so out of control. So now in terms of your question about like if it goes up to 1 point and 2 point, it all depends on how the government finances it with short-term or long-term. Right now, they're doing it the wrong way. They're financing short-term and they're borrowing long. I don't want to get in too much into the weeds, but basically what that means is that they could be borrowing longer and keeping their interest costs low. But if interest rates start to tick back up, which is inevitable, they're going to be paying huge amounts of interest, just interest alone, let alone paying back the deficit itself.
All right. Well, now, what's the solution? Are we going to default on our debt? I mean, that one report said we look like Greece or Portugal or Poland. Well,
it's actually worse than he said. Our debt's now about 130% of GDP.
130% of GDP? That's unbelievable. Our
GDP is around 21 trillion. The debt is now just about 28. Okay, there's basically considered to be 3 solutions. Number one, they're either going to raise taxes, and nobody wants that. Number two, they're going to cut spending, which I'll come back to in a second. Or number three, they're just going to inflate the debt away. In other words, they borrow $10 and they pay it back with cheaper money down the road. But I remember a very wise economic philosopher who I will not name, except that it was you, Pat. You said about 10, 15 years ago, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that the Lord had told you that the political will does not exist to deal with our spending problem in this country. I've never forgotten that, and we are seeing that right now. I mean, when you look at projections, they don't take into account things like pandemic spending, which nobody foresaw. And that's added like $5 trillion to the national debt, 4 or 5 trillion just in the last year. It's incredible.
You can inflate, but the truth is, I mean, who's going to loan us money? I mean, if we lose our reserve currency status, which is certainly very tenuous now, but the Chinese and the Japanese and the others in the world aren't going to lend us any more money, are they? They shouldn't.
That's exactly right. What that will mean is interest rates will go up because the United States will become a riskier proposition. So you have to pay people more, to account for that risk. What that would spill over into the general economy. Mortgage rates would go up. And the CBO itself projects that this would mean a lower standard of living for Americans, all this government spending.
Thank you, Drew. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what's going to happen, unfortunately. I wish it weren't the case. But, you cannot live on credit forever. I mean, in your own household, you can't do it. And the United States can't do it either. There's no such thing as too big to fail. They talked about banks being too big to fail. Well, the United States, you think, is too big to fail. But who's going to bail out the world if the United States goes bankrupt? And we have right now the reserve currency of the world. So that means we can print all the money we want to because all the other currencies are tagged to the dollar. But if we lose that reserve currency status, from then on out, we are in a heap of hurt. And we have the profligate. You cannot live a profligate life either in your own home or in the business you run or in your nation. And we have done it, and the exponential curve is working against us, and it's going to destroy this country financially. And maybe when God wants to bring judgment, this is the way he's going to do it. I don't think there's going to be a nuclear war, but it could be a financial war where we cannot defend ourselves against any other Chinese or any other aggressor. because we won't have the money to be able to buy the arms. Well, in other news, why weren't the Capitol Police ready for the January 6th invasion? Well, that's the question Congress posed to officials who lost their jobs over the fiasco. John Jessup has more.
That's right, Pat. Those in charge of defending and securing the Capitol left lawmakers with more questions than answers at the first of several hearings exposing how law enforcement missed the warning signs prior to January 6th. CBN National Security Correspondent Eric Phillips reports.
The hearing boiled down to three main themes: intelligence, preparedness, and response time. One witness flatly said he was surprised by the response, or lack thereof. These images remain burned into the memories of Americans, perhaps even more so for those in this room, many living through the attack as it happened.
We need to know, was there credible intelligence about potential violence? When was it known, and who knew it?
On the hot seat, the former U.S. Capitol Police Chief, along with the former sergeants at arms of both the House and Senate. Each resigned after the riots, with the chief now saying he regrets doing so. Also appearing before the Senate panel, the acting chief of the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. Three themes resonated repeatedly. First, the insufficient intelligence leading up to January 6th.
We properly planned for a mass demonstration with possible violence. What we got was a military-style coordinated assault on my officers and a violent takeover of the Capitol building.
Based on the intelligence, we all believed that the plan met the threat and that we were prepared. We now know that we had the wrong plan.
Then a general issue with preparedness.
No civilian law enforcement agency, to include the United States Capitol Police, is trained or equipped to repel an insurrection of thousands of individuals focused on breaching a building at all costs.
Thirdly, response. Acting Police Chief Robert Conti told the committee that D.C. Metro Police could not respond until he got the request from U.S. Capitol Police.
The mob's sustained assault on the Capitol precipitated an equally unprecedented response, with then Capitol Police Chief Steve Sund issuing an urgent request for MPD to come assist in defending the Capitol.
He says his force responded immediately, but he questions the sluggishness in requesting National Guard help.
I was surprised at the reluctance to immediately send the National Guard to the Capitol grounds.
Today will not be the last time lawmakers study what happened before, during, and after the siege. In fact, next week they will hear from representatives from federal agencies like the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Defense to find out more on intelligence matters and response time. Eric Phillips, CBN News.
Thanks, Eric. Speaking of Capitol investigations, Congress is holding hearings today on disinformation and extremism in the media, but they're targeting conservative outlets. Two California Democrats sent a letter to AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, and Cox asking if they plan to continue carrying Fox News, Newsmax, and One America News Network, and if so, why. They claim those channels broadcast misinformation about the 2020 election, directly influencing rioters who stormed the Capitol building on January 6. First Amendment advocates on the left and the right say while curbing misinformation is important, Pat, the hearing poses a threat to free speech.
Outrageous, but it's coming. You know, they're going to use any excuse they have. We talked about Rush Limbaugh, you know, and what he was able to do, but they had the so-called fairness doctrine in place. And it meant that if you sold time to a group like Rush or a broadcaster like Rush, you had to give free time to the other guys to balance it off. Now, if they say AT&T or Comcast or one of these others shouldn't be carry any conservative voice at all, then we're going to look at serious censorship. But when the Democrats seem to be in control of the House and the Senate, they can ram almost anything through. Then you take it to the Supreme Court and hope they rule in your favor. But this is a long, drawn-out process, and people should be fighting. But you ought to be absolutely aware of what it is, and you ought to mark your congressman down for re-election in the next election, because it's going to be a serious, serious threat to First Amendment freedom.